Welcome to Quantum RX, the podcast that teaches you how to move beyond stuck emotions and trauma for mind, body, and spirit healing. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie Davis. So today we're going to be talking about trauma, but in a little bit of a different context. For many thousands of years in a lot of the ancient traditional medicine practices, such as traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurveda, and even some other ancient medicine modalities, because they did not have the technology that we have today, they paid attention to the body and they paid attention to the signs. And there are lots of signs on your body that can give us little clues as to if you have trauma stored or a physiological process going on, or like some kind of biochemical imbalance. And so today we are going to get into that. We are going to talk about essentially what I'm going to talk about harkens largely to traditional Chinese medicine and facial diagnosis. So we are going to talk about the locations on the face where we can see if there are any traumatic hints. We are going to talk about the organ association with it and the emotions as well, and some of the signs and symptoms and conditions that you might find associated with those facial signs. And I'm going to give you a few other little tidbits that over my 20 years of practice, I have seen play out time and time again with regard to the kind of symptom correlation to an emotion. So there's going to be a lot of little gems and nuggets we're going to be discussing today. If you're curious as to if you have any stored emotions or trauma that might be causing your illness, preventing you from achieving your goals, or even just showing up as the best, most authentic version of yourself, I invite you to take my free Stored Trauma and Emotions quiz. You will find that link in the show notes. All right, so let's get in. I am going to, in this discussion, I'm going to show you, I'll point on the face to where you can see different signs of trauma or some kind of biochemical or physiological imbalance. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll absolutely be able to see this. If you're listening to the podcast, I will describe it as well. But if you want, you can check out the show on YouTube, or you can also just Google Chinese medicine facial maps. What I will tell you is that, you know, from person to person, it seems like people have kind of adjusted these maps according to what they've seen. But by and large, they're all mostly the same. So I wouldn't worry too much about, kind of the details, because you will find that when you Google it, there will be some differences from diagram to diagram. All right. So with that said, let's dive in. So we are going to start off with the liver, because the liver is the seat of anger. And you might have heard me talk about this before, but pretty classically, the liver is most often right here when you get the lines, the 11s, also on the outside. So like more of like your crow's feet area, or even a little bit out to the, it's not quite the temples, it's right below the temples. So in this area as well, that is the liver. And the liver is the seat of anger. And what's really, really interesting, I would say more than any other sign, I've seen this one play out in the trajectory of my career. Because when I, way back in the day, when I had my original certification through the Institute for Functional Medicine, they gave us a nutritional physical. So I could go through a person's entire body. And there are signs that we can see on your hands and your nails. Your face is another good place. All over your skin is actually really good. And there are actually places that you can kind of palpate on the body too. Like there's a place on the kind of outer shin where you can touch that is usually related to adrenal issues. And there's one lower down that's related to spleen. And I will say a lot of this harkens back to, again, those traditional modalities of medicine. But this is something that I learned way early on in my career. And I've definitely seen some of that. There's correlation. A lot of it does play out. Liver by far is the biggest one. And so, like I said, what you're going to see is mostly the 11s or a little line, a little vertical line. I actually have a little one there myself. You might see a little bit of a vertical line there. And then you'll also see typically crow's feet or other things that happen. Another sign might be liver spots, those just kind of dark spots that show up on your face. But that's also not to be confused with melasma, which that is a hormone imbalance, and that usually shows up bigger. Liver spots classically show up on your hands, backs of your hands. So there's that. But all of it is pointing to the imbalance in the liver. A lot of times it is stored emotions and anger. Anger is the biggest one associated with the liver. And I can say, like, I've seen this play out time and time again, because the vast majority of people who have come to see me over the years, when we do the lab testing, I would say liver function tests are usually fine. But what we will see is when we run stool testing or organic acids, you might find there almost always there's some kind of imbalance there in the biochemical pathways. And so what I did also end up seeing over time and finding this correlation probably about 15 years ago is when I really started to connect the dots, was a lot of these people did have anger, about childhood, the way they were raised, anger at a spouse, anger at a job. And interestingly, it typically is not just one area of anger. There's not just a whole lot of anger that's surrounding their, just one focal point. It's anger in their lives in general. So that was really, really interesting to me. And even the people that I get in the practice that have done all of the biochemical work and are really wanting to refine how they feel, they'll still have these facial signs. So it's really fascinating to me. And once we do the work, it typically improves. It's fascinating to do this work because obviously the 99.9% of my work is virtual, and I get to look at people's faces all the time, and I can see changes in their faces as we're working together. So that's always been something really, really interesting for me, but notable. And like I said, I can see for myself, my liver has always been one of my biggest issues. And it's not from the standpoint, it's not like my liver isn't working. My liver function tests are always awesome. It's when I do the organic acids, or I just know because hormones tend to be, or always classically were, one of my issues. And that's one of the first things. If somebody comes to us and says, hey, I've got a lot of hormone issues, we're not thinking it's a hormone issue. We're thinking it's usually a liver issue, biotransformation, detoxification, things of that nature. So that, when you go to see a practitioner, this is another kind of little gem or nugget. If they're trying to just look at your hormones and fix your hormones, I personally would run away, because if you have hormone issues, it's usually a result of liver and gut, first of all. Those are two of the major issues. But this underlying issue is usually stress. And, with that stress is dysregulated nervous system, and quite often, or I would say almost always, trauma of some kind. So, there's that. But I know it's interesting because obviously, like I said, I've been in functional medicine for 20 years and I've seen the rise of it. And with the rise of it, I've seen a lot of people who are not fully practicing it the way that it should be. I mean, functional medicine and is root cause medicine. And to me, I think that most of the root causes are in the realm of trauma and nervous system regulation. And all of these things that functional medicine treats they're treating the symptoms of the trauma and the nervous system regulation. And I know that's kind of a controversial take, and I will fully own it because I've been doing it for 20 years and I've seen the path. I've seen the trajectory of all of the people who, they do all the things. They have a perfect lifestyle and they eat a great diet and they've taken all the supplements and done all the protocols, yet their symptoms are still there, or they go away, but they come back. And the reason they're coming back is because of that dysregulated nervous system or the trauma component. So the people who do that work do tend to have so much more biochemical, physiological, mental, immune, emotional, spiritual resilience across the board. That is what I have observed in the people that I work with and also has been my own experience. So that was just sorry about that little segue or, kind of sideways conversation, but it's something that I think is really important and needs to be spoken about more. And I think that the pandemic really highlighted how stressed out and anxious and, just dysregulated we are societally. And we need to address that. So let's get back to the organs. The next organ would be the heart. Now, typically, the heart, when you're thinking about it in the traditional Chinese medicine context, you think about it as joy, which is great. And that's absolutely true. But it can also be associated with lack of joy. And when we're doing the trauma work, that's something that we see quite a bit. It is that lack of joy with regard to the heart. And so the heart is interesting. The heart on the face is typically kind of the outside, like right here on the eyebrows, this area. Sorry about that. I hit the microphone right here. So people who have stuff that shows up there, this area right here, right above the upper lip. So the area between the nose and the upper lip, that area too. I will give you the caveat on that too. Sometimes that can be related to reproductive stuff because reproductive is right here too. This is often the reproductive area, the whole kind of like chin and around the lips. That's considered reproductive, but the overlap would also be the heart here. The other thing I was going to say, it's not on the face, but on the earlobe. If you have a diagonal crease on the earlobe, that is very highly correlated to cardiovascular issues. So anytime I am talking to somebody or I see that, I usually point it out because in my experience, it's people with the most profound cardiovascular issues that have that diagonal crease on the earlobe. So that's a big one. But yeah, heart. I don't tend to see this one quite as much on the face, a little bit, but because I feel like it is typically more profound issues that show up for cardiovascular on the face and the head. So yeah, so like it would be like either like a wrinkle, a line, a dot in these areas. And like I said, it can be here. If it is here, it can be also reproductive related in my practice. And it also say might be because of the patient population that I serve. I would say I'm probably 60% female and 40% male in my practice. So that also is my population does tend to skew that way. And the males that I see tend to be, I don't want to say super young, 30s, some in their 20s, a few in their 20s, 30s, 40s, right at the onset of where cardiovascular stuff might be showing up, unless they're younger and it's really profound. I have some in their, 50s and 60s as well. But by and large, I'd say my male population is a little bit younger where some of those cardiovascular issues, if they're so profound, might not be showing up yet. So there's that. But heart is related to lack of joy or joy. But obviously in the work that we're doing, I see more of that lack of joy. When people improve and they have released the trauma and they have more nervous system regulation, like this whole area, the whole forehead across the board tends to soften. So we have the heart. The next area is the spleen, and the spleen is associated with worry. Let me show you. I'm going to show you really quick on your face where you would see spleen. And I'm also going to try to describe on the leg where you could notice spleen related issues as well. So spleen can be in the realm of, and again, I'm going to give you the caveat that some places there's overlap. Like I'll give you a basic, like a lot of times small intestine is here. And that's also, I see a lot of women with hormonal issues. And in this area, acne will show up here too. Spleen can kind of be in this area as well, because bladder is right on the outside here. And a lot of times those guys all go together. So we've got that. I'm trying to see if there are any other, I'm looking really quick to see if I can find a chart out there that has a more of the specific spleen related issues for you. Yeah. There aren't any more that are really calling out spleen other than sometimes in these areas. If you go to a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner or an acupuncturist, they also might do diagnosis of the tongue and then the wrist, and they can see if you are deficient in your spleen qi. But anything associated with the spleen is typically worry. And I can say that I've seen that one play out pretty well too in practice with regard to immune deficiency. And it's interesting because when we talk about what we treat in HMT as the modality, we say it's immunologically directed. And there is a body of science based on that. And when we talk about that immuno part, it's really speaking to the how a dysregulated nervous system, it ends up dysregulating your hormones and your immune system too. At some point when the podcast shifts over, I'm going to do a podcast specifically describing all of that so you understand what's going on. And I could also point to some of the bodies of evidence, the research, that there's a whole body of research in this area, this kind of psychoneuroimmune, or sometimes it's called psychoneuroimmune endocrine, because it's all, related. So there is that. And then also so I want you to, if you are sitting there and you want to try to kind of palpate, that palpate means touch, it's kind of on your shin. It's on your shin. It's on the lower shin, and it is more medial, or medial means towards the middle. It's on the midline of your shin. So if you can go up from where your ankle starts about 5 or 6 finger lengths, let me take that back. I say 4 because I'm palpating mine right now. If you can feel a tenderness there, you might have something going on with your spleen. So there is, that piece of the puzzle. I will tell you, over time, I think some of you who have listened to me for a while knew that part of how I got into functional medicine was my own hormone imbalances, which typically spleen on the Chinese meridians will always often show up for hormonal issues. And that point was always lit up on me. Like when the practitioner would palpate it, I would be like, you would think just a little touch on it off the table. I was so sore there. And they would always stick a needle in that area to try to get the chi flowing through there. And so it's an important point to check out. You can also check that out if you want to Google it as well. That is very well documented. You will not find any, I think it's spleen 9. I can't remember off the top of my head. So don't quote me on that. I think it's spleen 9, but I could be wrong. So yes, go check that out, palpate that on yourself, see if it's tender. That might mean you have some kind of just worry going on. I'll say anxiety kind of shows up there, because anxiety kind of hovers in that space between worry and fear. And so I would say maybe if that's an issue for you, you might consider, what are you worrying about? What are you anxious about? Over the years, I barely feel that. If I feel that's point on myself at all, it's very, very minor as compared to it was for a good probably 20 years of my life. It was pretty darn sensitive for a really, really long time. Okay, so let's move on to the kidneys. The kidneys are typically associated with guilt and shame. And I will also say fear to some extent, because depending upon the sources that you look at, fear can come into play, but predominantly it's guilt and shame. This one I can speak to with regard to my own experience as well. And I've seen this in some of the women that I work with that have more, I'd say, profound traumas, because this one came up for me after I had my miscarriages, because I think a lot of y'all know that I had my son, 2 miscarriages, then I had my daughter, and daughter was born, she's 7.5. So she was born in 2017. And I think I had COVID. I had COVID right when it happened. Literally, like it was announced that COVID was a thing. And we had been snowboarding a lot. And the place that it started here, and one of the places, the primary hotspots was in the kind of the mountain areas, this mountain towns and the ski resorts in Colorado, because there were some world travelers that had been there. And we had been there with our kids. And I don't believe it was the first time I had COVID, but I had COVID right there at I want to say very beginning or very end of February. It was very end of February 2020 or very beginning of March, but it was pretty mild, not a big deal. And then I had it again 6 months later. And after I had it that second time, my kidney function really depleted. And if you're looking at your labs, what you're going to see is that's going to be on your GFR or your glomerular filtration rate. Mine was always really good, pretty robust between like 115 and like 120 or 121. And mine went down into the 70s, which is not good. That is absolutely no bueno, not good. So when that happened, I mean, I hardcore, of course, like at that moment, I was still kind of teetering on like one foot fully thinking that it was biochemical and the other foot thinking that there was some kind of emotional or traumatic mechanism. But because of the state of everything, I was kind of leaning more towards biochemical. And I did a lot of stuff. I took a lot of herbs. There was a lot of like electrolyte balancing and things that I was doing to try to support my kidneys. And I got my kidney function back up to, I think the highest I've ever had it measured after that was 99. I don't think I've hit 100. I do not think I've hit triple digits, but I was much happier to have my kidney function back up there, because we know that the traditional outline when you get your labs back, what they have for GFRs, by the time you hit, it's 60 or below, your kidneys are pretty damaged. So you don't want to let your kidneys get to that point. You want to I like to see kidney function in the 90s or higher, but even, the higher the better for your GFR. So that is, kidneys. And I will show you on your face where your kidneys are. So kidneys are often below your eyelids here. So that's normally where we associate the kidneys. Also, kidney issues, I will say, for a lot of people, if you touch your lower back right above the crest, these are called your iliac crest, the top of the hip in the back of your body. If you palpate just above that, a lot of times people will have tenderness in there too with kidney related issues or kidney stones. Those are conditions that we will often see. I do see, like I said, that the kidneys are a big place for just guilt and shame. Really, a lot of it's guilt and shame. And I have seen, not in everyone, this is one that I see a lot less frequently, but I do see some people in my practice who, if they have a lot of guilt and shame, will have kind of the under eye, either under eye bags, discoloration, or heavily lined in that area. So that's another place that we can see some of these emotions showing up. The last big one from the traditional Chinese medicine wheel is the lungs. And the lungs are really, really, really important, because this is where we hold grief and sadness. And I do tend to find that more and more, and I will say, especially post-COVID, that lung area, I see things on people's faces. And so the lungs tend to be in this area, lower cheek. Lower cheek tends to be lung and respiratory. Just so you know, the stomach is right here too. The stomach tends to be like in the cheekbone area. And we'll talk about that too, but the stomach isn't really on kind of like the big five list associated with emotions. But yeah, the lower cheek area, right in this area, is the lung or respiratory area, and it is associated with sadness and grief. And what you will see sometimes, a lot of Chinese medicine mapping or the facial mapping has the large intestines right here, which would be your crease right here, that labial crease. So it's that, for people who are listening, it's that crease that's just, when you smile, you have that first crease that's kind of like just on the outside of your lips. So that you've got that crease there. That tends to be associated with the large intestine. And then just a little bit more outside is the lung area. So there's, that, and I will say that there is some overlap, right? There can be overlap in those areas. A lot of times, what I will see in people who have profound grief or sadness, they will have pretty deep folds here. The crease is pretty profound here. And then they might even have some lines just beyond that, or spots like discolorations on their face, or acne. Those are things that I will see. Acne, typically, this isn't like a super, super duper commonplace for acne in adults. Kiddos, yeah, sometimes, and when I say kiddos, I'm talking teenagers, but not adults. So that is where sadness and grief tend to proliferate. Like I had mentioned, post-pandemic, it seems to be, and people who had respiratory, like certain aspects of long haulers and respiratory issues really kind of had that lung aspect to their, either the illness of COVID or the long haulers. I have spoken with clients of mine who had a family member or a close relative, a family member or a close friend. And when we talk about this stuff, they're like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense, because this person was holding on to so much grief and had so much profound sadness in their life. And so that's another one that I tend to see a really big connection with, is my big ones. Liver is absolutely number one. I would say lungs are number two, kidneys are number three for like the pure, just kind of emotional aspect. Interestingly, I'm going to get into some of the more like the ones that aren't in the big five, but we still see signs on the face. So the pancreas tends to be the nose, and that is more rejection. It can be anger too, a little bit of anger, but largely the liver. But liver and pancreas are close friends. They work together in many ways in your body. So it's no surprise that anger can show up there too. And also some fear. You'll notice that depending upon the sources you look at, fear can show up in all different places. So that's another kind of big piece of the puzzle. But this is pancreas. Pancreas typically shows up as digestive issues because your pancreas produces a lot of your digestive enzymes. Between kind of like the pancreas, the gallbladder, and the liver, that's where so much of your digestive support comes from, outside of the stomach and the intestines. And so when those are off, you end up often with dysregulated digestion. So that always makes a lot of sense for people when we talk about that. Food intolerances. A lot of times food intolerances come from lack of those digestive secretions. So the pancreatic enzymes, the bile from the gallbladder, and then the support from the liver. Those are areas where you can have those issues as well. Like I had mentioned earlier, you got the large intestines here. Small intestine tends to be, kind of in the forehead area. Those are associated with your digestive issues. And that I commonly see as well. More in the realm, like the forehead will be acne. A lot of times forehead acne is related to, it can be hormonal, which also can be related. And like we spoke about before, kind of tied into digestion and like detoxification, biotransformation type of stuff. But the forehead, like that area will show up for acne, digestive issues. When I hear somebody or read on somebody's history forms that they have diarrhea from the emotional front, we think that we hearken that to like running away from something, or as one of my mentors would say, scared of shit. So there's that, because that tends to be more of an anxious type. The opposite end would be constipation, or holding on to something, or as like I said, one of my mentors would say, holding on to shit. So it's that type of stuff from an emotional standpoint. And I do see that's another area where I see lots of correlations with the diarrhea or the constipation, because IBS is kind of a throwaway diagnosis in the conventional medicine world, from the standpoint of they're like, oh, it's IBS, C, which is constipation, IBS-D, diarrhea, or IBS mixed, both. In that case, they're basically telling you that they don't know what's going on, but we're going to label it this. Typically, what's going on, the superficial level, is your gut is, like we talked about before, those digestive secretions are off. You have an imbalanced gut microbiome. There could be some more significant infections present. There's a lot of stuff that can be going on there. But I would say with 100% certainty, most of the time, it is people will tell me in their histories, they'll be like, oh, all of this stuff happened after I lost my job, or I had a death in the family, or lost my house, or X, Y, or Z. Insert any of the major life issues where you would have a very significant stressor. For some people, it's actually been going on their whole life, and their issues and stress and trauma that goes back to childhood. So there's varying degrees, but again, it goes back to nervous system dysregulation and trauma. So again, one of the first things that when I see somebody in my practice that has digestive issues as their primary complaint, like especially in that realm of IBS, we are talking about stress and the nervous system and how incredibly important it is to regulate. Because if we don't regulate your brain, which is your central nervous system, to your gut, which is your enteric nervous system, the vagus nerve. We talk a lot about vagus regulation and just vagus balance. That is the communication between your brain and your gut. If that is off, you're going to have lots of problems, and it shows up in many different ways. I see it in kids, even kids who have anxious parents or because when kids have anxious parents, they tend to take on that anxiety themselves, and it'll result a lot of times in GI issues. Sometimes it results in facial issues too. Interestingly, it'll be more in the form of like tics and blinking. I will say also that tics and blinking can be in a child purely related to infection or GI imbalance, because adults and children are completely different cans of worms when you're talking about them from a treatment standpoint, because kids don't have as much life history and they don't have just all of the things built up in their lives, and they still have so much neuroplasticity and just overall resilience across the board. Kids issues tend to be a lot more basic and easier to address. So, while I do think it's really, really important to make sure that your child has a regulated nervous system and feels safe, we're talking about regulating children. I'm always like, the parents, you need to start with the parents, and often the mom. The mom tends to set the tone for a family. And so if she's dysregulated, her kids are going to be dysregulated in some way. Eventually, the tables might turn. And if you have a dysregulated parent, a child, when they are a little bit older, might go the opposite direction and be like, oh, because my, parent is kind of so like anxious and worried and like nervous all the time and afraid of everything, I need to be solid and I need to be balanced. That happens a lot. It doesn't have to show up as true parentification where the child is taking care of the adult, but they will change their behavior to balance out what they're seeing in the adult. So that's something else I see. But by and large, when I'm dealing with children in the age of 9 or 10 or less, because my youngest current patient is 4 months old. Yeah, they, babies and kids heal pretty fast because they do have so much more resilience and reserve and just less life history. The older they get, and I feel like sadly, probably 10 years ago, I would have said a 12-year-old, but because of the way the world has changed, I keep on bringing that number lower and lower because I'm seeing more tweens, so like 10, 11, 12-year-olds dysregulated and having many more issues than they used to have in the past. So that's a unfortunate reality of what's happening in the world. So let me see if there's anything else. Oh, I mentioned that I would, another area, the reproductive. So reproductive does tend to be anything around the mouth. And that usually is like, especially here on the chin, is going to show up as acne from hormone imbalances. But you'll also see like women who have like a lot of lines like tons of lines around their lips. When they get sometimes younger, you'll see it. That would be very much an indication sometimes of pretty profound reproductive issues, whether it could be in the realm of major cysts on the ovaries or polycystic ovaries or fibroids, things like that. That will tend to show up here. Sometimes even some of the reproductive cancers, there could be an association. I've seen that a few times too in my practice as well. And so I wanted to make sure that I pointed that out too, just because like you can look at yourself in the mirror. I know back in the day when all of my hormone issues were full blown, I had kind of the dark spots or the melasma. I had it kind of on my cheeks. I had it down here, had a little bit of it on my forehead, which really interestingly, that usually speaks to hormones, but especially adrenals, so stress. And that does not surprise me because that period of my life was extraordinarily stressful. And like I said, I have a little line here that has definitely softened over time. It's not the one over my eyebrow. I don't know how well you guys can see that. This is a scar from my friend hitting me with a shaving cream can on Halloween night when we were juniors in high school. She went out to spray me and she nailed me and I ended up having to get like 7 stitches there. But like right here in the midline, I have a little line that used to be deeper, but has definitely softened over time because of kind of that hormone, again, the hormone issues, anger, frustration. And then for me, I had like the kidney stuff, the guilt. So when you start checking out your body, there are lots of things you can see. Like on nails, I can see if you have a lot of those white dots. If you don't, I will give you the caveat of if you have a job where you are hitting things a lot or you play a sport where you might be hitting things a lot, your nails, you might get a little nail spot, like a little nail bruise, and it shows up as a white spot. There's that if you're using your hands a lot. But if you don't, lots of times that's a sign of zinc deficiency. We can also see respiratory issues, usually due to like oxygenation or nutrient levels on the nails too. Like they'll show up as ridges. I could give you a whole dissertation on, kind of the nutritional and kind of external physical that we can do on somebody. But yeah, I would encourage you all to start look at your face, look at your hands, look at your skin. Are there things that are telling you something? Because like I've always said, our symptoms are our body's way of telling us there's something that needs to be addressed. And based on where they're at, you can kind of get some hints as to what might be going on from a biochemical and or emotional standpoint.
If you made it this far, I truly appreciate you. Remember, knowledge is just the beginning. Taking action is what truly sparks change. If you're overwhelmed and don't have enough energy to make it through the day, I invite you to book a free 20-minute coaching call with me. It's a no-obligation chat where we can discuss your health goals and how I might be able to help you achieve them. Visit the link in the episode description to book that call. Until next time, keep striving for wellness and remember, you have the power to not just survive, but thrive in motherhood.